Welcome back, dear friends. Before we begin, let me know where in the world you are watching, and please don't forget to subscribe and like to support the channel. Picture a city where women strolled through university campuses in miniskirts, their hair flowing freely in the warm Mesopotamian breeze. Imagine nightclubs pulsing with music until 3 in the morning, glasses of whiskey glinting under coloured lights, laughter spilling onto streets lined with date palms. Think of modern apartment buildings rising against ancient horizons, their windows reflecting a future that seemed limitless. This was Baghdad in the 1970s, not the Baghdad you think you know, not the city of conflict and chaos that dominates today's headlines. This was something entirely different. This was Iraq's golden age, a moment when oil wealth transformed an ancient capital into what some called the Las Vegas of the Middle East. It was a time when the impossible seemed to be happening every single day. On any given morning in 1975, you might have seen something that would shock anyone familiar with Iraq today. Young women in short shorts playing basketball in a gymnasium, their movements captured by photographers documenting what felt like a new era. Female university students debating philosophy with their male classmates over tea, no chaperones required, no eyebrows raised. Doctors in white coats, 46% of them women, making their rounds through hospitals equipped with the latest medical technology. This wasn't a Western city. This was Baghdad, the heart of Iraq, and it was experiencing a transformation so profound that even its own residents sometimes struggled to believe what they were witnessing. The streets themselves told the story of this metamorphosis. Construction cranes dotted the skyline like metal forests, raising buildings that would have been unimaginable just a decade earlier. The sound of jackhammers and cement mixers became the city's new soundtrack, a symphony of progress that never seemed to sleep. Modern highways carved through neighborhoods, connecting districts that had once been separated by unpaved roads and ancient grudges. Underground, new sewage systems were being laid, replacing infrastructure that dated back to Ottoman times. Above ground, streetlights illuminated avenues where darkness had once fallen absolutely after sunset. Everything was changing. Everything was new. Everything seemed possible. But there was something else in the air too, something harder to define. It whispered in the corners of cafes where certain topics were carefully avoided. It lingered in the eyes of men who dressed too well and seemed to appear too often in the same places. It lived in the careful dance of conversation, the artful way people learned to express enthusiasm for the new Iraq, while never quite addressing how this transformation was being orchestrated or at what cost. Paradise, it seemed, required a certain kind of blindness. But for now, in these golden hours of the 1970s, most people were more than willing to close their eyes to the shadows and bask in the extraordinary light. The morning call to prayer still echoed across the city, just as it had for centuries, but now it competed with new sounds: the rumble of buses on freshly paved roads, the chime of traffic signals at intersections that hadn't existed 5 years ago, the buzz of air conditioning units installed in buildings where people had once relied solely on the ancient art of cross-ventilation and the shade of enclosed courtyards. Baghdad was waking up to a new kind of day, and the contrast between its ancient soul and its modern aspirations created an energy that was almost electric. In apartments throughout the city, families were experiencing luxuries that their grandparents could never have imagined. Running water, hot and cold, available at the turn of a tap. Electric stoves replacing the traditional charcoal braziers. Refrigerators humming in kitchens, preserving food in ways that had once required elaborate systems of salting and drying. Televisions broadcasting not just local programming, but shows from across the Arab world, images from Lebanon and Egypt and Syria, flickering into living rooms where decisions about the future were being made over breakfast. Women were getting ready for work, and this simple fact represented a revolution. They weren't just teachers and nurses, though those professions had long been acceptable. They were engineers and architects, accountants and pharmacists. In some hospitals, 70% of the pharmaceutical staff were women, their expertise valued and their contributions essential to the healthcare system that was being built with oil money and ambition. They wore what they pleased. Some chose traditional dress, others embraced Western fashion with enthusiasm. Miniskirts that would have caused scandals in the 1950s now barely drew a second glance in central Baghdad. Short dresses, fitted pants, heels that clicked purposefully on marble floors. The freedom to choose was itself a kind of intoxication. The markets were unlike anything previous generations had known. Imported goods arrived from across the world. French cosmetics sat beside Egyptian perfumes. British biscuits shared shelf space with local sweets. Japanese electronics promised to bring the future into every home. The Iraqi dinar was strong, worth more than $3 and people spent with a confidence that came from believing the good times would never end. Merchants called out their wares in a dozen languages, because Baghdad in the 1970s was nothing if not cosmopolitan. Jews and Christians, Kurds and Arabs, Shia and Sunni, foreigners from every corner of the globe, all moving through markets that seemed to overflow with everything anyone could possibly want. Students flooded the universities, and this represented another kind of miracle. Education was free, from primary school through university, a gift from a government that understood that an educated population was essential to the modern state they were trying to build. Young men and women sat side by side in lecture halls, taking notes on subjects their parents had never dreamed of studying: engineering, medicine, computer science, international relations. The curriculum was rigorous, and the facilities were increasingly impressive. Foreign professors were recruited to teach at Iraqi universities, bringing expertise and methodologies from institutions in Europe and America. Iraqi students who had studied abroad were returning home, choosing to invest their knowledge in a country that seemed to be on the cusp of greatness. The optimism was tangible, almost visible in the way people carried themselves. There was a straightening of spines, a confidence in gazes, a willingness to dream that came from watching dreams actually come true. The government was making good on its promises, at least in the realm of physical development. Roads appeared where there had been none. Clinics opened in rural areas that had never seen a doctor. Electricity reached villages that had known only lamplight. For many Iraqis, the benefits of the oil boom were not abstractions, but concrete improvements in their daily lives. Yet even in these morning hours, in the bustle of getting ready for work and school, there were small signs of something else. The newspaper that mentioned an official who had suddenly been transferred. The friend of a friend who had taken an unexpected trip abroad. The subtle adjustment of conversation when certain names were mentioned. The Ba'ath Party was everywhere, not just in government, but woven into the fabric of institutional life. Party membership could smooth a path or clear an obstacle. Its absence could close doors that had appeared open. Most people learned to navigate this reality with the skill of sailors reading dangerous currents. The city's transformation had not happened by accident or by some organic process of gradual development. It had been sudden, dramatic, and rooted in a decision made in 1972 that would reshape not just Baghdad, but the entire nation. The Iraqi government had nationalized the oil industry, seizing control of assets that had been dominated by foreign companies for decades. The Iraq Petroleum Company, which had functioned as a state within a state, extracting the country's most valuable resource while returning relatively little to the Iraqi people, suddenly found itself expelled. It was a bold move, one that required backing from the Soviet Union and careful diplomatic maneuvering. But it worked. Then came 1973, and the world changed. The oil crisis sent prices skyrocketing, and Iraq, which had just taken full control of its petroleum sector, found itself with revenues beyond anything its planners had anticipated. Money flooded into government coffers. The numbers were staggering. Iraq's gross domestic product increased by 1,325% in the 1970s. 1,325%. It was an economic explosion unprecedented in the modern Middle East. Budget reserves climbed past $35 billion. For a country that had been, just 2 decades earlier, primarily agricultural and relatively poor, this was a transformation that bordered on fantasy. The government had plans for this money, ambitious development schemes that had been drafted years before the oil windfall made them possible, new industrial facilities to diversify the economy beyond petroleum, agricultural modernization to increase food production, infrastructure projects to connect the country and support commerce. social programs to improve health and education. The Ba'ath Party, which had taken power in a bloodless coup in 1968, positioned itself as the architect of Iraq's leap into modernity. Their ideology blended Arab nationalism with socialist principles, at least in theory. In practice, what emerged was something more complex, a system where state control and private enterprise coexisted in an uneasy dance, where progress came with strings attached, where every benefit carried an unspoken obligation. Saddam Hussein, though not yet president, was already the most powerful man in Iraq by the mid-1970s. As vice president, he controlled much of the day-to-day governance, while the official president, Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, served as a more ceremonial figure. Saddam understood power in ways that went beyond ideology. He built loyalty through a combination of rewards and fear. He placed relatives in key positions. He expanded the security apparatus. He made himself indispensable. But he also understood that power required legitimacy, and legitimacy in the Iraq of the 1970s required delivering tangible improvements to people's lives. The oil money made this possible. Hospitals, schools, roads, electrification, these were the currency of popular support, and Saddam spent it with calculated generosity. The transformation was visible in ways both large and small. Grand projects like the Baghdad metro were proposed, though they would never come to fruition. New government buildings rose in architectural styles that attempted to blend modern functionality with traditional Islamic design elements. Ancient sites were renovated with care and sometimes excess. Museums expanded their collections and their facilities. The Iraq Museum became one of the finest repositories of Mesopotamian artifacts in the world, a source of national pride and a destination for scholars from across the globe. Cultural institutions flourished under government patronage, as long as they stayed within acceptable bounds. But beneath the statistics and the construction projects, something more profound was happening to Iraqi society. The massive influx of oil money was changing relationships, expectations, and possibilities in ways that would have seemed impossible just a generation earlier. Women were at the center of this transformation, and their changing status would become one of the defining features of Iraq's golden age. In 1976, Iraqi government statistics showed something remarkable. Women constituted 40% of teachers, 30% of doctors, 50% of dentists, and an astonishing 70% of pharmacists. These weren't token appointments or ceremonial positions. These were working professionals with real authority and responsibility, making decisions about curricula and diagnoses and treatments that affected the lives of millions. The numbers represented a social revolution that had happened with stunning speed, supported by laws and policies that actively encouraged women's participation in the workforce. The legal framework made a difference. Reforms to personal status laws had curtailed men's traditional power over divorce and remarriage. Courts, not husbands, now had the authority to dissolve marriages. A man could no longer take a second wife without his first wife's permission. Women gained better access to custody of their children in cases of separation. These changes faced resistance from conservative religious and tribal leaders, but the Ba'ath government, committed at least rhetorically to secularism and modernization, pushed them through. The General Federation of Iraqi Women, established in 1972, became a vehicle for expanding women's opportunities, even as it also functioned as an arm of the Ba'ath Party. The Federation ran more than 250 community centers across Iraq, offering job training, literacy programs, and legal advice. Rural women who had never been to school found themselves in classes learning to read and write, using examples drawn from their own agricultural experiences. The literacy materials would say things that made sense in villages, where education had previously been available only to boys from families wealthy enough to spare their labor. Women who graduated from university were guaranteed employment by the state. This wasn't just a policy, it was a promise that was actually kept. Female engineers found positions in government ministries. Female architects contributed to the design of new schools and hospitals. Female scientists worked in laboratories that were being equipped with modern technology. The government needed educated workers to staff its expanding bureaucracy and ambitious development projects, and it was willing to challenge traditional gender roles to get them. On the streets of central Baghdad, the visual evidence of this change was impossible to miss. Women in miniskirts walked to work or university without fear of harassment or censure. Some wore jeans, others wore traditional dress. Many mixed Western and Eastern styles in combinations that reflected their individual tastes and identities. At sporting events, female athletes competed wearing uniforms that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Photographers captured images of women playing basketball in short shorts, their athletic prowess on display for local and international media. These weren't secret photographs smuggled out to shock foreign audiences. These were official images, celebrated as evidence of Iraq's progressive nature. The freedom extended beyond fashion into social life. Mixed-gender gatherings became common, even unremarkable. A woman could attend a poetry reading or an art exhibition or a concert without a male relative escort and without social stigma. Intellectual women regularly participated in the city's vibrant cultural salon scene, where ideas were debated and artistic movements were born. Friendships between men and women, including friendships that crossed sectarian and ethnic lines, flourished in an environment where cosmopolitanism was valued and encouraged. But this golden age for women carried a contradiction at its heart. The rights and opportunities they enjoyed were granted by a regime that was simultaneously consolidating authoritarian control. The same government that promoted women's education and employment was also building a security apparatus that would eventually terrorize the population. The freedom to wear what you wanted existed alongside the careful censorship of what you could say. The Ba'ath Party gave with one hand, while preparing to take with the other. Still, for women living through the 1970s, the changes felt revolutionary and liberating. Mothers watched their daughters attend universities they themselves had been forbidden to enter. Grandmothers saw their granddaughters become doctors and engineers, professions that had seemed as distant as the moon. The speed of the transformation meant that 3 generations of women could sit together in a living room and represent 3 entirely different experiences of what it meant to be female in Iraq. The youngest might be studying computer science and dating without parental supervision. The middle generation might be teachers or nurses, their professional lives carefully balanced against traditional expectations. The oldest might be illiterate, having never been given the choice of anything else. As the sun climbed higher in the Baghdad sky and the morning gave way to afternoon, the city's energy shifted. Government offices filled with bureaucrats processing the endless paperwork that a centrally controlled economy demanded. Factories hummed with production, many of them newly built with oil revenues and Soviet technical assistance. Construction sites remained active despite the heat, because the building boom showed no signs of slowing, and in the background of all this activity, music played. Baghdad had always been a musical city, its traditions of maqam stretching back centuries. But the 1970s brought new sounds to mix with the old. Ilham al-Madfai, dubbed the Baghdad Beatle for his fusion of Iraqi folk music with Western rock, was at the peak of his career. His music embodied the spirit of the era, traditional melodies played on ouds and combined with electric guitars and drums, lyrics that spoke of love and longing and the complexities of modern life. His concerts drew huge crowds, young people mostly, hungry for music that reflected their hybrid identity, rooted in Iraqi culture but open to global influences. Radio broadcasts mixed Arabic classical music with international pop. Egyptian singers like Kulthum and Lebanese stars like Fairuz were beloved throughout the Arab world and played constantly on Iraqi radio. But you could also hear the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, American soul and British rock, all part of the cosmopolitan soundtrack of a city that prided itself on its openness. Record stores did brisk business, selling everything from traditional Iraqi folk music to the latest releases from Europe and America. Young people traded cassette tapes, creating mix recordings that captured the eclectic tastes of a generation caught between worlds. The nightlife scene became legendary. As afternoon faded into evening, a different Baghdad emerged, one that would have been unrecognizable to visitors familiar only with the city's ancient reputation as a seat of Islamic learning and piety. Abu Nawas Street, running along the Tigris River, transformed into the beating heart of Middle Eastern nightlife. This was where the magic happened, where the impossible became routine, where Baghdad earned its reputation as a city that never slept. Nightclubs lined the street, each with its own character and clientele, but all sharing an atmosphere of abandon and possibility. The Alwiya Club attracted the wealthy and connected, its interior decorated in a style that mixed traditional Iraqi motifs with modernist design. The Baghdad Hotel hosted performances by musicians from across the Arab world, its dance floor packed with couples moving to rhythms that blended traditional Arabic music with international styles. Smaller venues offered more intimate settings, jazz clubs where musicians improvised until dawn, traditional maqam houses where the ancient art form was preserved even as everything around it changed. The alcohol flowed freely, whiskey, imported and expensive. Arak, the anise-flavoured spirit that had been part of Levantine culture for generations. Beer from Europe and local breweries. Wine from Lebanon and France. Cocktails mixed with practiced skill by bartenders who had trained in Beirut and Cairo and had brought their expertise to Baghdad. The sight of people drinking in public, openly and without shame, was just one more example of how different this Baghdad was from what would come later. There were no religious police, no morality squads, no one checking to ensure that Islamic law was being observed. The Ba'ath government was secular in its orientation, and nightlife was seen as evidence of sophistication rather than sin. The entertainment was extraordinary. Live bands performed every night, their members a mix of Muslims, Christians and Jews, their music a conversation between traditions. Female singers took the stage in evening gowns, their voices carrying across rooms filled with cigarette smoke and perfume. Dancers performed, their movements drawing from classical Arabic dance traditions but adapted for modern sensibilities. The audiences were diverse, young couples on dates, groups of friends celebrating milestones, foreign visitors marveling at the unexpected sophistication, government officials and military officers unwinding after long days of managing the country's transformation. The culture around these nightclubs was remarkably open. Women danced with partners they weren't married to, and no one suggested this was scandalous. Mixed groups of friends shared tables and laughter without concern for sectarian or ethnic divisions. Foreigners were welcomed, their presence seen as proof of Baghdad's international status. Conversation flowed as freely as the drinks, discussing everything from music and films to politics and philosophy, as long as one knew which political topics were safe and which required more careful navigation. Some establishments stayed open until 3 or 4 in the morning, their lights spilling onto streets where vendors sold late-night snacks to revelers. Kebabs grilled over charcoal braziers, their smoke mingling with the scent of jasmine from gardens along the river. Tea sweetened with sugar and flavoured with cardamom, served in small glasses that clinked like bells. Fresh fruit juices pressed from oranges and pomegranates. The entire sensory experience of these nights created memories so powerful that decades later, Iraqis who had lived through this era would speak of it with a mixture of nostalgia and disbelief, as if they were describing a dream rather than historical reality. But Abu Nawas Street wasn't just about nightclubs. Fine dining restaurants served cuisines from around the world, French cuisine prepared by chefs trained in Paris, Italian trattorias offering pasta and wine, Chinese restaurants where Iraqi diners experimented with chopsticks and dim sum, traditional Iraqi restaurants that elevated local cuisine to an art form, serving masgouf, the grilled fish that was Baghdad's signature dish, prepared with techniques passed down through generations. The food scene reflected the city's cosmopolitan character, where tradition and innovation, local and foreign, existed in creative tension. The riverfront itself was a gathering place. Families strolled along the Tigris in the early evening, children running ahead while parents walked more slowly, enjoying the breeze that rose off the water. The river that had witnessed 5,000 years of Mesopotamian history continued to flow, indifferent to the human, dramas unfolding along its banks. Young lovers found quiet corners to talk away from the eyes of family and neighbours. Fishermen cast their lines, hoping for the catch that would justify their patience. Poets gathered to read their work aloud, continuing a tradition that stretched back to the Abbasid Caliphate, when Baghdad had been the cultural capital of the Islamic world. Gardens were everywhere in the city, testimony to the Iraqi love of greenery and the ancient art of creating shade in a desert climate. Date palms that had been planted generations ago provided shelter from the brutal summer sun. Jasmine and roses filled the air with fragrance. Orange trees offered both beauty and fruit. These gardens represented a different kind of wealth, one measured not in oil revenues but in the patient cultivation of beauty across decades and centuries. They reminded residents that Baghdad's identity was older and deeper than the current moment of oil-fueled transformation. The cafes that dotted the city centre were centres of intellectual and social life. Here, men and increasingly women gathered to drink tea or coffee, to smoke water pipes, to play backgammon or cards, to read newspapers or argue about politics, art and philosophy. The conversations could last for hours, participants coming and going, the topics shifting but the fundamental nature of these gatherings remaining constant. They were spaces of relative freedom, where ideas could be explored as long as one remembered which lines could not be crossed. Nabi Street, the famous book market, thrived during this period. Vendors sold everything from ancient manuscripts to the latest novels from Egypt and Lebanon. Political treatises sat beside poetry collections. Religious texts shared shelves with secular philosophy. The variety itself was a form of wealth, evidence of a society engaged with ideas and comfortable with intellectual diversity, at least within certain bounds. Students spent afternoons browsing the stalls, building personal libraries that would shape their thinking. Scholars sought out rare volumes to support their research. Ordinary readers looked for entertainment and enlightenment. Cinema was enormously popular. Baghdad's movie theatres showed films from across the world. Egyptian comedies and melodramas, always popular in the Arab world. Indian musical extravaganzas with their distinctive blend of romance and spectacle. European art films that challenged viewers with experimental narratives and aesthetics. American blockbusters that brought Hollywood glamour to Mesopotamia. Iraqi filmmakers were also active during this period, creating works that documented their society in transition. The act of going to the cinema was itself a social ritual. Families and groups of friends dressing up for the occasion, discussing the films afterward over tea and sweets. Fashion became a form of expression and identity. Department stores imported the latest styles from Paris, London, and Rome. Local designers adapted international trends to local tastes, creating hybrid fashions that reflected Baghdad's position between East and West. Women's magazines featured fashion spreads, alongside articles about careers and social issues. Men experimented with everything from traditional dish dashers to Western suits, to the casual styles that were becoming popular globally. The freedom to choose how to present oneself, to use clothing as a means of self-expression rather than submission to rigid codes, was one of the era's most visible freedoms. Art galleries showcased the work of Iraqi painters and sculptors who were gaining international recognition. The Baghdad modern art movement had been developing since the 1950s, and by the 1970s it had matured into something genuinely distinctive. Artists like Jawad Salim had pioneered a synthesis of traditional Iraqi and Islamic artistic elements with modernist techniques. Their work appeared in public spaces, monumental sculptures that celebrated Iraqi history and aspirations. The Monument to Freedom, commissioned in the late 1950s, but remaining influential through the 70s, stood as a symbol of the hopes invested in independence and self-determination. The everyday rhythm of life in 1970s, Baghdad was punctuated by small luxuries that had become normal. Air conditioning in homes and offices, a blessing in a climate where summer temperatures regularly exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Refrigerators and freezers that changed food preservation and preparation. Washing machines that liberated women from hours of hand-washing clothes. Televisions that brought the world into living rooms. Telephones that connected families and friends across the city. These technologies were transforming domestic life in ways that were just as significant as the grand development projects. The educational system was experiencing its own golden age. Schools were being built at an unprecedented rate, particularly in rural areas that had previously had minimal access to education. The curriculum was ambitious, emphasizing science and mathematics alongside traditional subjects. Teachers were relatively well paid and respected, their profession seen as crucial to national development. Universities expanded their facilities and faculties, offering programs in disciplines that hadn't existed in Iraq a generation earlier. Scholarships enabled students from modest backgrounds to pursue higher education, creating opportunities for social mobility that would have been unimaginable to their parents. Yet underneath all this progress, Underneath the nightclubs and universities and shopping centres and dreams of unlimited prosperity, there were foundations being laid for something darker. The Ba'ath Party was not content with economic development. It demanded political loyalty and was willing to use increasingly sophisticated methods to ensure it. The security apparatus expanded even as the economy grew. The Mukhabarat, the intelligence services, were everywhere and nowhere. Their presence felt more than seen. Informants operated in every institution, from universities to government offices to factories. People learned to be careful about what they said and to whom. Jokes about the government could be dangerous. Criticism, even mild criticism, could lead to questioning. The disappeared, those who vanished without explanation, were relatively few in the 1970s compared to what would come later. But they were enough to send a message. The regime was watching. The regime was listening. The prosperity came with expectations of gratitude and obedience. The Ba'ath Party membership itself became a kind of currency. Joining the party could smooth paths to employment, education, and opportunity. Remaining outside it didn't necessarily prevent success, but it could create obstacles. The party organized the population through its various fronts and organizations, creating structures of control that penetrated every aspect of social life. Youth groups, women's organizations, professional associations, all were either directly controlled by or heavily infiltrated by the party. This was the price of the development, the shadow side of the Golden Age. Saddam Hussein's power grew steadily through the decade. He cultivated relationships with military officers while simultaneously limiting their independent power. He placed loyalists in key positions while removing potential rivals through transfers, demotions, or worse. He built a network of family and tribal connections that ensured his control even as the formal structures of government appeared to function normally. He understood that fear and favour, when properly balanced, could create a system where people policed themselves, where the threat of consequences was often more effective than actual punishment. The relationship with the Soviet Union deepened during this period. Soviet technical assistance helped with oil development, industrial projects, and military modernization. Soviet advisors worked alongside Iraqi technicians, transferring knowledge and skills. Arms sales from the Soviet Union equipped the Iraqi military with modern weapons systems. The Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation, signed in 1972, formalized this relationship, much to the concern of Western powers and conservative Arab states. Yet Iraq maintained a degree of independence, nationalizing oil over Soviet objections and refusing to become a simple client state. Relations with neighbors were complex and often tense. The Kurdish north remained a source of ongoing conflict. Kurdish guerrillas, supported at various times by Iran, Israel, and the United States, fought for autonomy or independence. The Iraqi government responded with a mix of military campaigns and negotiated settlements, neither fully successful. In 1975, the Algiers Agreement between Iraq and Iran led to Iran withdrawing support for the Kurdish insurgency in exchange for Iraqi concessions on border disputes. The Kurdish resistance collapsed, and many fighters and civilians faced harsh reprisals. This episode demonstrated the limits of minority rights in Ba'athist Iraq, where stability and central control took precedence over pluralism. Syria, despite being governed by a sister Ba'ath party, was increasingly viewed as a rival and threat. The two Ba'athist regimes competed for leadership of the Arab nationalist movement, each accusing the other of betraying true Ba'athist principles. This ideological split had practical consequences. In 1976, Iraq stopped using Syrian oil pipelines, opting instead to route its oil through Turkey. The two countries engaged in mutual destabilization efforts, supporting each other's dissidents and opponents. The tension demonstrated how nationalist ideology could fracture along lines of state interest and personal rivalry between leaders. But for ordinary Baghdadis navigating their daily lives, these geopolitical tensions existed at a remove, important but not immediately pressing. What mattered more was the job that paid well enough to afford the new consumer goods flooding the market. The school that was educating children to standards higher than previous generations had known. The hospital that could treat illnesses that had once been death sentences. The sense, however fragile and contingent, that life was getting better and would continue to improve. The late 1970s saw Baghdad at the height of its transformation. The city looked and felt modern in ways that seemed to validate all the promises that had been made. Yet cracks were beginning to show. The oil boom had created inflation that eroded the purchasing power of fixed salaries. The rapid expansion of government had created bureaucratic inefficiencies and corruption opportunities. The focus on urban development meant rural areas, while better off than before, still lagged significantly behind cities. Social tensions that had been suppressed or managed were not resolved, merely postponed. In Iran, revolutionary fervor was building. The Shah, long seen as a bulwark of stability in the region, faced mounting opposition from religious and secular groups. When the Iranian Revolution succeeded in early 1979, it sent shockwaves through the Middle East and particularly through Iraq. The new Islamic Republic, led by Ayatollah Khomeini, explicitly called for the export of its revolution to other countries, including Iraq. The large Shia population in Iraq, concentrated in the south but present throughout the country, was both an opportunity and a threat from Tehran's perspective. July of 1979 marked a turning point. Saddam Hussein, who had been the de facto ruler for years, formally assumed the presidency after pushing the ailing Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr aside. He immediately staged a dramatic purge of the party leadership. In a meeting that was videotaped and later shown to party members throughout Iraq, Saddam accused high-ranking Baathists of participating in a Syrian-backed plot against the regime. One by one, names were called out. The accused were led from the room. Some would be executed by firing squads made up of their former colleagues. The message was unmistakable and terrifying. Saddam's power was now absolute, and no one, regardless of rank or past service, was safe if he perceived them as a threat. This purge marked the beginning of the end of the Golden Age, though the full implications would take time to become clear. The nightclubs still opened, the universities still taught, the oil still flowed. But something fundamental had shifted. The bargain that had sustained the 1970s, prosperity in exchange for political acquiescence, was being replaced by something harsher. Fear, which had always been part of the system, became more overt. The security services, already extensive, expanded further. The apparatus of totalitarian control that would come to define Saddam's Iraq was being put fully in place. For those paying attention, the signs of what was coming were evident. Political arrests increased. Disappearances became more common. The boundary between acceptable and dangerous speech narrowed. Some Iraqis, particularly those from minority communities, or with the means to leave, began to emigrate. They left behind property and careers, choosing uncertain exile over the possibility of remaining in a country that was changing in ways that frightened them. Most stayed, either because they lacked the ability to leave, because they couldn't believe it would get as bad as some feared, or because their love of country and hope for the future outweighed their fears about the present. The Iran-Iraq War, which would begin in September 1980, was still in the future, but the groundwork for it was being laid. Saddam saw the Iranian Revolution as both a threat and an opportunity. A threat because it could inspire Iraq's Shia population to revolt. An opportunity because Iran's military was in chaos following the revolution, seemingly vulnerable to a quick strike that could expand Iraqi territory and eliminate a rival. The decision to invade Iran would prove to be one of the most catastrophic choices in Iraqi history, leading to 8 years of brutal warfare and hundreds of thousands of casualties. But that tragedy was still to come. In the final years of the 1970s, Baghdad still sparkled. The lights along Abu Nawas Street still glowed. Young people still dreamed dreams that seemed achievable. The oil wealth, while not infinite, seemed sufficient to support the ambitious plans for continued development. Iraq's economy was diversifying beyond petroleum. Industrial production was increasing. Agricultural output was improving through mechanization and irrigation projects. On paper, Iraq was becoming the modern, developed nation its leaders envisioned. But the human cost of this development was becoming harder to ignore. The suppression of Kurdish autonomy, the marginalization of Shia political and religious leadership, the systematic elimination of political opposition, the creation of a personality cult around Saddam that bordered on the absurd. Images of the leader were everywhere, on billboards and in newspapers, in schools and government offices. His name was invoked at every public ceremony. This was not the natural evolution of a successful development program. This was the construction of a totalitarian state, using the resources provided by oil to build systems of control that would eventually trap and terrorize millions. Photographers like Latif Al-Ani documented the Iraq of this era, creating a visual record that would become precious beyond measure. His black and white images captured construction sites and cultural events, university students and street scenes, the ordinary and the monumental. These photographs would later serve as evidence of what had been possible, proof that the nightmare to come was not inevitable, documentation of a moment when Iraq seemed poised to claim a different future. Looking at these images decades later, knowing what followed creates a kind of vertigo, a sense of terrible waste and lost possibility. The 1970s in Baghdad represented something precious and fragile. It was a moment when oil wealth, political will, and historical circumstance aligned to create opportunities that had never existed before. Women entered professions that had been closed to them. Education reached populations that had been kept in ignorance. Modern medicine and infrastructure extended the length and quality of lives. Cultural and intellectual life flourished in an atmosphere of relative openness. These achievements were real, and they mattered to the people whose lives they improved. But this golden age was built on foundations that could not sustain it. The authoritarian control necessary to maintain the Ba'ath Party's grip on power was incompatible with the genuine pluralism and freedom that a truly modern society requires. The suppression of dissent and the elimination of political alternatives meant that when the system failed, as it inevitably would, there were no mechanisms for course correction or peaceful transition. The social tensions that development had papered over rather than resolved would return with devastating force. The tragedy of 1970s Baghdad is not just what was destroyed in the wars and chaos that followed. It's what might have been, but never was. The educated women who could have contributed to their society, but were instead forced into restrictive roles or exile. The intellectuals and artists who could have continued Iraq's cultural renaissance, but were silenced or fled. The ordinary people who dreamed reasonable dreams of prosperity and security and saw those dreams turn to ash. The potential for a different kind of Middle East, where oil wealth genuinely served broad-based development rather than funding military adventures and maintaining dictatorships. Those who lived through this era carry its memory like a wound that never quite heals. They describe it to children and grandchildren who struggle to reconcile the stories with the reality they know. Baghdad was like Paris, they say, and the younger generation looks at them with confusion or disbelief. Women wore miniskirts to university. The nightclubs were full every night. We felt safe walking the streets at any hour. These statements sound like fantasy, like propaganda or delusion. But they were true for a moment in a specific time and place before everything fell apart. The transformation of Baghdad from the Paris of the Middle East to a symbol of endless conflict and chaos was not inevitable. It was the result of specific choices made by specific individuals, choices driven by ambition and fear and ideology. It was the product of regional and international forces that manipulated Iraq for their own purposes. It was the consequence of a development model that prioritized state control over genuine participation, that built physical infrastructure while neglecting the institutional and social infrastructure necessary for sustainable progress. Understanding what 1970s Baghdad was like requires holding multiple truths simultaneously. It was genuinely a time of unprecedented progress and opportunity for many Iraqis. It was also the era when the seeds of future catastrophe were being planted. The prosperity was real, and so was the oppression. The freedom experienced by some coexisted with the surveillance and control experienced by all. The brilliance of the moment cannot erase the darkness gathering at its edges. The legacy of this era lives on in the Iraqi diaspora, in the memories of those who were there, in the photographs and films and music that survived. It serves as a reminder of what was possible and what was lost. It offers lessons about the relationship between development and freedom, between wealth and wisdom, between the dreams of leaders and the needs of ordinary people. It stands as a monument to both achievement and tragedy, to the heights humans can reach and the depths to which they can fall. For those of us listening to this story from a distance, whether of time or space, the tale of 1970s Baghdad should provoke reflection about the complexity of history, which is never simply good or evil, but a tangled web of both, about the fragility of progress, which can be undone in a generation or a decade, about the importance of building systems and institutions that can outlast individual leaders and their ambitions, about the universal human desire for dignity, opportunity and safety, and the many ways that desire can be fulfilled or betrayed. The story doesn't have a happy ending, but it has an ending that matters. It reminds us that societies can change dramatically in short periods of time, for better and worse. It shows us that oil wealth alone cannot buy lasting prosperity if it's not coupled with genuine political and social development. It demonstrates that freedoms once granted are not automatically permanent, that they must be defended and renewed by each generation. It teaches that the price of authoritarian control, even when accompanied by material benefits, is ultimately too high because it destroys the human capacity for self-determination and genuine flourishing. Baghdad in the 1970s was a miracle and a mirage, real enough to touch but ephemeral enough to vanish. It was a city of contradictions, where women in miniskirts walked past political prisoners being led to interrogation, where nightclubs thrived while dissidents disappeared, where the future seemed bright even as darkness gathered. To remember it accurately requires honesty about both its achievements and its failures, its promise and its betrayal of that promise. The lights along Abu Nawas Street eventually went dark. The universities that trained a generation of professionals saw their best minds flee into exile. The hospitals lost their equipment and their expertise. The infrastructure deteriorated under sanctions and war. The dreams died, sometimes suddenly in moments of violence, sometimes slowly in years of grinding despair. But for those who were there, in that golden moment of the 1970s, the memory remains vivid and painful and precious, a reminder of what Iraq was and might have been. As we close this journey through a lost world, it's worth remembering that the people who lived through this era were not so different from us. They wanted what most people want: safety for their families, opportunities for their children, the freedom to pursue happiness as they understood it, the dignity of being valued for who they were rather than what they represented politically or ideologically. For a brief moment in the 1970s, some of them got closer to those universal desires than their parents had, and that mattered, even though it didn't last. The lesson of 1970s Baghdad is not that progress is impossible, or that the Middle East is doomed to autocracy and conflict. It's that real progress requires more than money and infrastructure. It requires institutions that genuinely represent and respond to people. It requires the freedom to criticize and change course when policies fail. It requires leaders who see themselves as servants of the public good rather than as masters to be served. It requires a social compact based on mutual respect rather than fear. Without these elements, even the most spectacular development is built on sand, magnificent today and gone tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through a Baghdad that most of the world has forgotten or never knew existed. If you found this story meaningful, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me continue researching and sharing these hidden histories. In the comments, I'd love to hear from you. Are there other cities or eras you'd like me to explore? Do you have family connections to this period of Baghdad's history? Let's continue the conversation. Until next time, sleep well, and remember that history is never as simple as we imagine it to be. Every era contains multitudes, contradictions, lessons for those willing to look closely. The past is never truly past. It lives in memory and in the consequences of choices made by those who came before us. May we learn from both their triumphs and their tragedies as we build our own futures.